So the RSP Bond Overlay results for the year ending 2018 are in. And to be honest, they suck. Quite a bit, actually. It shouldn't come as a surprise for most of you, but, they suck if you choose to abandon the strategy. Basically, as I say, shoot your financial planner, financial advisor, and just unwind the whole thing. But, before we give up on the entirely on the RSP Bond Overlay this year, there are a few things that I would like to point out. You see, the RSP Bond Overlay has a much higher bond component inside the RSP versus its, comparative of the RSP only strategy. And, bonds actually had a relatively modest year this year, with very little return, but at least a small return nonetheless. And while equity returns, of course, were in, some cases, obviously double-digit negative return, for an RSP Bond Overlay, these were held outside, these assets were held outside the RSP with the investment leverage. So you see, the good news about the RSP Bond Overlay is that your RSP is about the same or possibly higher than it was a year ago. And that in itself isn't a bad thing, right? But, in comparison to an RSP only strategy, these negative returns in the equity markets would have been experienced in your RSP, and therefore your RSP is going to be worth less. You see, the question is, what are you going to do about it? And if you're using an RSP only strategy, and if you did have a portfolio, for example, that had some bonds in it, well, okay, good. The idea then is that this presents an opportunity to rebalance this, and of course that makes a lot of sense. But, what happens if you had, for example, invested 100% in your equities within your RSP? I don't know how you can rebalance, and there's really nothing to rebalance because you don't have any bonds in it. But you see, the same isn't true for the RSP Bond Overlay. You've actually got options to consider, and you have a lot more options, which could also present more opportunities as it relates to both tax as well as your long-term investment return. And that's the important thing to understand. The RSP Bond Overlay strategy is designed to be a long-term investment strategy. I mean, it too should never be implemented for just a one-year time horizon, because equity markets, of course, like we've just seen, are more volatile in the short term. And the question is more around, what are you going to do to help yourself in the long term today? And this is where the RSP Bond Overlay is actually more flexible. And here's why. If you're holding your exposure or equity exposure in an RSP only strategy, and let's say you've got a high percentage of exposure to equities in your RSP, for example, 60 or 70% or higher, you really don't have a lot of bonds available to help you rebalance, which then limits how much you can actually take some advantage of lower equity values. Not to mention that it's also really tax inefficient to have this loss inside the RSP. With an RSP Bond Overlay strategy, you have options, and technically you can declare a capital loss. And this can be used in the future or possibly against, capital gains on other assets that you have. And so, the rub is a bit that, the RSP Bond Overlay strategy does also suggest that you rebalance. And this year, it means it is going to recommend you borrow more money to buy more equities. And that, of course, is a choice for you to make. But, if the recent activity on the TSX, as well as analyst predictions in the market, is any indication of how things will be in a year from now, I think it could be a good decision. But as always, past returns and, predictions aren't always indicative of what's going to actually happen. And who knows, the market doesn't always perform as we expect it. So you also need to be prepared that it may be negative again. But, by the way, as I say, there is yet another option here if you're using an RSP Bond Overlay and not comfortable in borrowing more. And that is, you've got the RSP asset still there. And therefore, you have the ability to purchase additional equities inside the RSP to help rebalance yourself. So here's the thing. Investment strategies, be it with or without an investment leverage like the RSP Bond Overlay, do need to be rebalanced from time to time. Talk to your financial advisor about this. But having access to additional bonds within your portfolio does also present some additional considerations and opportunities, both from tax efficiency perspectives, but also from a portfolio perspective. And as I say, this obviously isn't something that should be done without a qualified financial advisor who fully understands all of the nuances that the RSP bond overlay or simple RSP brings with it. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this blog podcast. This is Will Prinzen, founder, Sciuridae.